So thank you all very much for coming today. I'm Rachel Griffith. I'm the incoming president of the Royal Economic Society and a professor of economics. So it's really great to see so many of you here today. My job is to introduce Oriana. That's a super easy job. So Oriana is a professor of economics at the London School of Economics. She also directs one of the big policy research institutes that does sort of policy relevant, very applicable research. And one of the things that that the Royal Economic Society tries to do in this lecture is to portray the diversity of things that people work on in economics and the kind of real-world applications and the exciting things that you can do with economics. So Oriana has a very esteemed career. She's won many awards. She has lots of honors to her name. I could spend a long time telling you about those. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do instead is just tell you a little bit about why I'm excited about hearing her talk. So Oriana is really one of the exciting new researchers of her generation. And what I think particularly exciting about her work is it really portrays how you can both combine creativity with economic rigor to answer questions that are important in terms of making people's lives better. In particular, Oriana's work looks at some of the poorest people in society, living in very poor countries in Africa, for example, and thinking of ways that we can use data and insights from economics to try and make real change and enable those people to live better and more fulfilling lives. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Oriana so that we can hear all about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for coming. So I would start, I think delegation is the key to success. So I would start by making you work instead of me. I will tell you what I think economists do, but first I would like to ask you what you think it is that economists do. So if you just go to that website, paul.ev/Oriana Bandiera, or by text, following the instructions up there, if you could just tell me one word, first word that comes to mind when you think of economics. Try not to express feelings about it, like boring might be the first word that comes to mind. Let's not do that. Let's think about what economics is about. What is the first topic that comes to mind? Interesting. I never had that one before. Other things equal. Pricing. If you only do one word, it's going to work better. Economics is about Brexit. I wish she hadn't been. You didn't have to. That's very good. Well, I think you've worked enough. We stop it now. Well, you saw there were lots of things there, but one of the big things was money. The other big thing, unfortunately, was Brexit. We'll talk more about that. And then there was policy and allocation and poverty. There's lots of things. And I gave this lecture a week ago in London, and you see that what came up there was quite similar, and the bigger thing was money. I've been a bit obsessed about figuring out what people think that economics is about.
Money, bank, debt.
Money,
Knowledge, equality.
money, maths, maybe statistics.
Money, finance, and banks.
Money, employment, financial crisis and GDP.
Markets and numbers.
Numbers, maths, money, money, money. These were LSE students at Fresh Affair, so the London School of Economics. So we should take their opinions into account. And then, of course, the source of all information, Google. What do you get if you Google, what do economists study? On a daily basis in banks. So economics studies the way that society uses scarce resources to produce goods and services. If you look at the images, it gets a bit weirder. Economists do it with models, pop everywhere. But now, finally, let's give the word to the people.
The question is, what is the right level for government debt?
Factors that influence early child development.
Does economic stress lead to violence or racism or xenophobia against minority groups?
And social incentives.
Relationship between unemployment and domestic violence.
Suppose that oil prices were to rise by $10 per barrel. What's the effect of that going to be on GDP growth or inflation?
The long-run effects of the social safety net.
The country is large, has a lot of scale. Are they actually more productive?
Why are we seeing people in India eat less?
Now, if you feel like that, you're probably right. It is all very confusing. Is it about money, inflation, banks, finance? Is it about poverty, children in India eating more, eating less, domestic violence, inequality? And is it all about data or maths or stats? And finally, do all economists think that people are very selfish? Is that a key ingredient of the discipline? Or do we take into account that we are embedded in society? What I will try to do in this lecture is to organize things a bit for you. And I'm going to put together the building blocks of economics. I have children who are very fond of Lego, so now I only think in Lego terms. And a lot of what I'm going to show you, I have thanks to two colleagues, David Card and Stefano Della Vigna Berkeley, who put together data on what economists write about. I have to say that economists write articles and publish them in academic journals. So what these two co-authors have done is to put together all the titles of all the articles published in the last 40 years in the top 5 journals. So this is actually a very good snapshot of what economics research is about. Now, if you do the word cloud using those articles, the results that you get are quite different from the word clouds that we've done today in the lecture, what I've done in London, and any word cloud that's ever been done asking people what do economists do. And in particular, for once, there is, you can search, there is no money in there. We searched because we weren't sure that this could be possible. But in the last 3 years, in over 1,000 articles published in the top 5 journals in economics, money does not make the top batch of words. The key word that comes up as the most relevant word, most common word in economics, is evidence. And next to it is effect, and to the left is impact. I cannot tell left and right, so bear with me if that confuses you. They're all the same thing. It's about measuring the effect, providing evidence, showing impact. In other words, if you take even the top 3 words across the decades, back in the prehistory of the 1970s, all the way to the last 10 years, you see that all the words methodologically are always, like the first word is always about a method. It's model, 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 and then evidence sneaks in the early 2000s, and then evidence becomes the most common word. What this is telling us is that economics is not really about something in particular. Economics is a tool, right? And the tool gives you a systematic way of thinking on how people make choices to maximize their happiness, we can say, subject to some constraints. As every tool, it can be used for good or evil or sheer incompetence. Right? A tool in itself is not good or bad. You can use it in a good or bad way. Now, economics is not defined by the topics, such as money, by values, such as markets are good. Now, the standard stereotype of the economist is somebody who's obsessed to leave everything to markets and don't have any state intervention. That doesn't define economics, nor is it defined by assumptions like everybody is selfish. But nevertheless, it is important to understand how relevant these things are in economics, because it is the topics who ultimately determine who studies economics and how it's used. So that's what I'm going to start with. I'm going to start with topics. Okay? These are the most common topics in what we call applied microeconomics. Okay? We talk about inequality, we talk about unemployment, we talk about labor and tax, Medicare, because a lot of the literature is in the United States, so that is a United States program. We talk about elections, we talk about externalities in the environment, we talk about democracy, and as you can see, a lot of other things. What about the money? It can't be that economics doesn't talk about money. Of course it does. There it is. These are the top money words. There's money, inflation, GDP, crisis, wealth, financial cycles, and assets. And if you go back to the beginning of time, so to speak, at least the beginning of the data that I have, money was a lot more common. That is, in the title of these articles, we had a lot more of money topics than what I call people topics. Nowadays, however, many, many years later, more than I can count, the order has swapped. We still talk about money, but it's about 10% of the articles that talk about money, and over 30% talk about these people topics that I just showed you. Another way of seeing it is to go and see what people win Nobel Prizes for. There's a Nobel Prize in economics. Every year, come early October, you see people walking nervously because the newspapers open bets, and then people are all gossiping. Do you think this person got it this year? Do you think that person got it this year? And what the Nobel Prize is given for is some piece of research which has had a lot of influence on economics. So it's not given for the latest thing that you wrote. So none of these is something which has been done in the last 2 years. These are works of a lifetime. And as you can see, these are the last 5 years. These are not topics that normally come to mind when you think of economics. Take the last Nobel Prize is for climate change, technological innovation and climate change and how it affects growth. The previous one is incorporating psychology into economics. So forget about people being selfish or even forget about people being rational. As the winner put it, when we started thinking about these things, people thought we were lunatics, and now the lunatics are running the asylum. Oliver Hart and Ben Holmstrom talk about market imperfections in every possible way and what can be done to solve them. Angus Deaton got his prize for studying inequality, and Jean Tirole for market power and how to curb it. What economics is really useful for as a tool, and this is a word that I was very happy to see coming out very prominently in the word cloud here, is to inform policy. And this is important for two reasons. The first is that you want to implement policies that work. The second is that you can keep politicians accountable for the policies that they claim work. So why is economics useful for policy? Well, economics makes you understand the goals that people and firms have, and therefore that allows you to understand how people are going to respond to policies. without this knowledge, policies might actually create bigger problems than the ones that they're meant to fix. Many policies are what I called fixing the symptom by wishful thinking. And let me give you an example. Banker bonuses caps. Now, this is prehistory to you, but in 2008, the financial system collapsed, and people started blaming the fact that many bankers were given a lot of money as a reward for speculation. Okay? And it was proposed that we put a cap. We said, forget about giving 2 million in bonus. We put a cap, at most you can give still a lot of money, say $500,000. Now, the aim of that policy was to reduce inequality and to reduce risk-taking. But in the end, an economist would tell you, without thinking very much about it, that it would produce more of both. Why is that? Well, you have to think who sets the bonus and whether this is going to change their demand for setting bonuses. So who sets the bonus? Well, it is the banks. The banks decide to pay their employees this big payout at the end of the year. Why do they do that? Because they want their bankers to work hard. So if the bankers know that at the end of the year, when he's performed well, he's going to get a lot of money, he has more incentives to perform well. They also want to attract the best people for doing this. Okay. I'm not saying this is a good or a bad objective, but this is the objective of banks. What does the cap do? The cap does not change the goal of the banks. The goal of the banks is always the same. But it does remove one instrument. You cannot reward people who do well. So how will banks respond? They will still want to attract the good bankers, so they will just increase their fixed salary. Before, bankers were paid an outrageous amount of money if they did well. With the cap, they are paid an outrageous amount of money no matter what they do. You can imagine that that is not the intended effect of the cap. It creates more inequality because regardless of how badly or how well they perform, they're still paid. And it creates more risk-taking because now they've got nothing to lose. They're always paid the same outrageous amount of money. There are plenty of examples of this sort. Even longer ago, it was decided by the then government that A&E departments in the country were not doing the best they could. So they started giving prizes and punishments according to how quickly the A&E would process people. So from the moment they enter the A&E to the moment they are sent home or sent to an appropriate ward, how long is that time? And depending on the length of the time, they were rewarded or punished. Of course, the intention was to speed up the processing. But there is another way of reducing that time, and that is to let people in at a later point. How can you achieve that? Leave them outside in the ambulance. Let them come in only when you're ready for them. Clearly, that wasn't the intention of the policy, because it decreases the welfare of the patient who needs to be in the A&E and instead is kept in the ambulance. And it reduces the number of ambulances that are available to go and pick up other people. We did an exercise with obesity and the problem with obesity. Here is an incentive scheme, a policy change that resulted in an increase in sugar consumption. This policy change, this was done in Florida. The Board for Education thought that teachers weren't teaching hard enough. So they thought of giving them bonuses as a function of the performance of the students in their school. In other words, they said, well, if your students do better in the test, you're going to get $1,000 or something of the sort. The teachers who know the students well know that when you give them very sugary drinks, kids have a sugar high and they perform well because they're all energized. And that is a way of improving the test score, which gets them the bonus without improving learning at all. And ultimately, who benefited from this scheme were the dentists in Florida who had a lot more patients. There are plenty of examples. I could go on and on about telling you stories about policies that they're wishful thinking policies. They want to cure a symptom without taking into account that that symptom hides a behavioral response, and that if you don't take into account how people respond to the policy, you're going to end up doing worse than you started with. Now, as I mentioned, economics is a tool. So let me tell you a bit about the tools that we use. Okay? I will start with models. Models typically involve maths. Okay? Why do we use maths? This is one of the most criticized aspects of economics. It is told that we use maths to make things complicated so that we exclude people from understanding economics. You often read that economics models are unrealistic. They don't capture everything about the world. Actually, the truth is the other way around. We use maths to simplify things. A famous economist, and I don't know whether this story is true, but it is always said that at some point there was some famous economist, and the name of the famous economist changes depending on who tells you the story, who said that we don't use maths because we're very smart. We use maths because we're stupid. And we need the clarity of maths to tell us that if we think that 2 + 2 makes 5, the maths won't let us do that. Okay? Let me give you an illustration of how a model can simplify things. I don't know if you're familiar with the London Shoob. This is how the London Shoob looks in reality. This is a map of the London Shoob that depicts the direction of the lines, the real direction of the lines on the ground, and depicts also the distance between the stations. Okay? You will agree with me that this is a pretty messy map. Okay? You go to this part where Oxford Circus and Tottenham Court Road is all a mess. The lines keep wiggling about. But now, do you need to know that the Northern Line is not straight? Do you need to know that the Piccadilly line keeps bending as if it has a mind of its own? You don't really need to know that because you're underground. Who cares which directions you're going? So a good model makes it easier to navigate reality by getting rid of non-essential details. Okay? This is how we used to see the tube map. Is it realistic? Not at all. I mean, the Northern Line clearly is not a straight line. And many other things are not how they are in reality. It's not realistic, but that's not its purpose. Its purpose is to help you go around in an easier way. Now, are all simplifications a good thing? Well, not all models are good. This is a bad model. I've simplified even further. You will agree with me that it's a lot simpler. I got rid of station names. It's pretty useless. Okay? You can't navigate the London Underground like that. So models, again, are a tool. If done well, they help you navigate reality. If done badly, they confuse things. Now for assumptions. Everybody's favorite assumption, the Homo economicus. What does he have in common with these characters? Well, like all of them, is pretty nasty, supposed to be selfish, rational, all meant in a bad way. But like all these characters, is imaginary. The Homo economicus really doesn't exist. Nobody believes that it does. And you might wonder, if it does not exist, why make it up? Why should we use this figure, which is unpleasant unrealistic, what's the use of it? Well, in many cases, it is a very useful simplification. It's like, okay, of course people care about others. Of course the Northern Line is not a straight line. But if we need to understand the demand for cereal, and some economists study the demand for cereal, do we really need to know that people care about their children or about their friends? Not really. It's just a good simplification that makes your life easier and allows you to see the forces that are at play. But of course, if you're trying to explain something like charitable giving, and you start with an assumption of people are selfish, you're not going to go very far. So it depends on what you use in the model for. Sometimes the assumption is good. As we saw in the Shoob map, we can simplify things by making the line straight because it doesn't matter once we're on the ground. And sometimes the same exact assumption might be bad. So it does depend specifically on what it is that you want to explain. Now let me go to the other side of the toolbox. If you remember, when I showed you the most common words, there was a change around the early 2000s, where up to the early 2000s, it was all about models and theory, and then we shifted towards evidence. Okay? What is evidence? Evidence is the use of data. And we use data to understand how people behave and to evaluate policies. The main challenge when doing this is to measure causality. What do we mean by causality? Well, causality is like I switch the switch and the lights go off. It's the switch that causes the light to go off. Right? I go outside, it's raining, I open my umbrella. It's not my umbrella that makes it rain. It's the rain that makes me open the umbrella. So you have to imagine if an alien came to the Earth and saw that whenever it rains, people have umbrellas up. They wouldn't know whether it's the rain to cause the umbrella or the umbrella to cause the rain. How would they go about assessing that? Let me make a more university-related example. Say that you finish primary school and you have to decide whether to go to a school G or a school C. And you're given this piece of data. You're told that 50% of the students in school G end up going to a Russell Group university, and 25% of students of school C do the same. Assume that you believe that going to a Russell Group university is a good thing. Might not be, but assume that you believe that. The question that you want to know the answer to is whether it is the school that makes students do better. Because a whole host of other things could be going on. It could be that the school G is in a better neighborhood with parents who have more books at home, and it's got nothing to do with the quality of the school. It's all the input of the parents. Or it could be that the school G selects the kids in a different way. So the school itself does nothing. It's all in the selection. How do we go about answering this question? Well, the best way to think about it is to imagine that you can travel multiverses. And you can identify among the multiverses two parallel universes that are identical, but for one thing. In universe 1, team goes to school G. In universe 2, it goes to school C. Everything else is identical. Team's parents are the same. They have the same number of books. Team friends are the same. They have the same number of PlayStation to distract him from studying. Team's relatives are the same. They give him the same amount of money to buy PlayStation games. Okay? Now, most economists, what we do on a day-to-day basis is to try and create the equivalent of parallel universes. We would ideally create the real parallel universe, that'd be cool, but we can't do that. So what we find is ways to keep everything the same, but for the thing that we want to evaluate. Let me give you an example. I'm going to take you to Zambia. Zambia is a country in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I happened to be, a while ago, this was back in 2010, I happened to be in the office of the HR director of the Ministry of Health. Right? We were discussing what were the main challenges that the ministry faced in Zambia. And he was mentioning that the hardest thing for them was to get medical staff to work in remote villages. So they had come up with an alternative plan. Instead of sending nurses from the capital, because as soon as you send a nurse to a remote village, the nurse checks out the village and runs away as quickly as she possibly can. So instead of doing that, they would select people from the community, train them, and then send them back to the communities to work there. Now, the choice that the HR director faced was whether to incorporate these rural nurses in the hierarchy of the ministry or whether to keep them separate. And incorporating them in the hierarchy would allow them to be promoted in the future, would give them a path to a career, whereas keeping them separate wouldn't. And the dilemma that he had is, what will happen now that they see themselves as civil servants? Will they retain the connection to the community? This was a beautiful moment because we thought, wait, you want to know the answer to this question. Economists are desperate to know the answer to this question. The question is, who is more effective at delivering public services? People who are motivated from the bottom of the heart, or people who are talented and are motivated by having a career? So we thought, well, we can try this for you. Zambia is very large. This was a nationwide program. So there were 48 districts. In 24 of them, we advertised the position as something to be done to help the community. So the main headline is the one that you see there at the bottom with the circle, is, do you want to help your community? Become a CHW. CHW is the acronym for Community Health Worker. And the poster had, this is the poster that was put in the schools, in the health clinics, everywhere in the village. It had a list of benefits, and all the benefits listed were about helping others in the community. In the other 24 districts, we tried something else, actually something radically different. Same picture, same qualification, same application method, but now the main reason for you to do this job is to have a boost to your career. Right? And the benefits are likewise changed to become a highly qualified member, access future career opportunity, and the like. We implemented this. We waited for 2 years. And after 2 years, we found that a group did a lot better. In the group that did better, mothers went to the clinic to give birth, so maternal mortality potentially fell. Children were visited more often, and they were vaccinated more often. And the bottom line is that after 2 years, in the 24 districts where we used one poster, I'm not going to tell you which, malnutrition was 25% lower. Now the question is, for you again, if you can go back to your phones, what do you think? Just give me a second, because this. Which advertisement do you think drew in more effective nurses? Was the HR director correct in being worried about offering a career or not? Okay, I think this is pretty stable. Okay. The 63% think that the community ad drew in more effective nurses. 37% say the career ad. I've done this many times. Even before I discovered this technology, I would do it by show of hands. It never, ever, ever happened to me once the career won. Some people think that, but the majority of people, sometimes by a large margin, sometimes by a small margin, you're a pretty average margin, always think the community is going to do better. Now, let's think economically about this. What is the problem? I'm going to do a model which doesn't look much like maths, but you can look at the paper and that's where all the maths comes in. But models don't need to be maths. What they need to be are representation of reality, which simplifies things and makes you see the forces at play. So the concern is that people vary in the social motivation that they have. Some people have big red hearts. They care a lot about helping others. And others are empty-hearted. Okay? So social motivation in that figure goes increasingly from left to right. Now, if you pay people very little or you offer them no material rewards whatsoever for the job, the only people that are going to apply for it are people with a big heart, because there's no other reason to do this job. It's only out of the goodness of your heart. As you increase the rewards, you start attracting the more cold-hearted people. And eventually, there must be a level of rewards that makes everybody want the job, regardless of whether they care about the poor, sick people in Zambian villages, just because the money is very good. And that is the main concern that people have when they say, we shouldn't pay nurses much. They say this in this country as well, because if we do, we're going to attract these empty-hearted people who do it for the money. Now, there is another element that matters, and that is ability. People just don't differ in how big their heart is. It's also how big their head is, how full their head is. So they differ in ability of skills. And here, as you give low rewards, you only attract low ability people, because people with high ability have a better job elsewhere. As you increase the rewards, you attract more able, and so on. So as you increase material benefits, you attract people of higher ability. If you put it all together, these are all the possible applicants, right? They range from everybody's nightmare, the stupid guy with an empty heart at the bottom left-hand side corner, to everybody's dream job candidate, which is somebody who's not only extremely generous, but also extremely intelligent. Okay? And then at the two opposite corners, you have the guy with a big, big head, but couldn't care less about the world. And then the well-intentioned, we all know types like that, however, somewhat not particularly skilled. So you have to worry about these two dimensions. Now, what's going to happen once you change the rewards? Well, with low rewards, only one type of person will apply. And those are the very generous, but not particularly intelligent ones. If you increase the rewards, two things happen. You move horizontally there, and you attract somebody with a bit less generosity, but still an empty head. Okay, that's the direction you don't want to go. That's what people are worried about when they say, if we pay nurses more, we're going to attract people, other things equal, who don't care. But you also move on the vertical axis. So you keep the same generosity and you attract somebody slightly more skilled. You keep going like that, you keep moving in both directions. Okay? You attract everybody's nightmare, the empty-headed, empty-hearted one, but at the same time, you also attract the person who's very intelligent and has a lot of generosity. Now the question is, who would you choose? among all of these? You have the choice, they're all applying. Who would you choose? Well, I tell you what the Zambian panels did. They faced all these applicants in the career treatment. They faced the guy with the empty heart and empty head. They faced the guy with the big heart and big head. They all hired the best guy that they could find. So now, I don't know whether you want to give it another go. Based on this, would you like to change your answer? See the power of economic models. Right, I think we've converged. Right? What is the intuition here? You wouldn't have thought about it without having a model, because you were thinking of things separately, in separate boxes. You were thinking of skills and generosity as two separate things, and you were focusing on generosity because that is important, without thinking that the selection mechanism would also attract the best of all worlds, the generous and intelligent person. And most importantly, the one thing that people never think without having a model that guides them is that it is true that when you offer more rewards, you bring in people who don't care at all about the job and who are also not particularly intelligent. But who cares? You don't have to hire them. They can apply. You know, if there is an opening for the position of Chancellor of the University of York, I can apply. They're never going to give it to me. Okay? So this person can apply, doesn't have the skills, doesn't have the generosity to do the job. You can attract however many you want of those. Whether you do or not is moot because you don't have to hire them. And that's what happened. We measured the prosociality of these people. There are psychological tests that you can do to do that. And we measured their skills. And we did find that indeed, the people attracted by the career poster, they had the same level of prosociality, but they had more skills. They had higher grades in the GCSEs. They had taken more GCSEs in science, like biology and chemistry, which you reckon if you want to be a nurse, it's good that you know biology. So they were overall a lot better qualified. So you might wonder whether you should study economics. You can think of it as an economist, right? Think of what you're trying to achieve in life. Think of everything that you like. Do you like to earn money? You like to make the world a better place? You like to work with maths? You like to work with data? Then think of the constraints that you face. And the main constraint that we all face is time. If you study economics, you're not studying something else, and that is the main cost. But the important message, which I hope I convey today, is that the topics that you see being studied in economics shouldn't distract you at all. Because once you learn the tools, you can ask whichever question you like. It is the tools that are powerful, and that is what should attract you to economics. If it does, it is not the questions that economists are working on now, because we don't want people to work on the same questions. You can find out more about recent economic research written in an accessible way, because if you go and read the paper that I just discussed. It's probably going to give you a headache between page 5 and page 7, I would say. But economists try to write things in an accessible and very short way. And these are some of the websites where you can find these summaries. Now I'm going to leave the floor to you. You can start asking questions. And you have 2 technologies. You have the old technology, put your hand up. And then you have a fairly complex tweeting technology, where if you tweet your question with the hashtag what economists really do, possibly tagging the Royal Economic Society, somebody will read those tweets and will read them out loud to me. Okay? So fire away, start asking questions. Sorry, this might have not been clear. I'm not going to talk anymore, only to answer your questions. I think you have to wait for the mic. They're coming. Yeah, that mic. Don't break out into a song now.
I'll try not to.
Okay.
Yeah, on the model you used when you was talking about nurses and pro-sociality and competence and skills, you separated them out as like separate variables, but for a nurse in particular, I was thinking that sociality is like empathy. Would that not be a component of skill?
It is, definitely. So you can think of 2 sets of skills. And the question is whether by offering more rewards, you create a trade-off between these 2 sets of skills. What we show, both theoretically and with the evidence, is that you don't. So if you call empathy a skill, that's one skill set, and being trained in biology is another skill set, you don't have to choose between the 2. You can attract people who have both.
Is it all right? Thanks for the answer. Is it all right if I ask you another question as well?
Yeah.
Because it was about, I've always been confused about charity in particular, because my conception of charity is that it's a commodity within itself given to charity, because there's a criticism of sort of the econ, of the purely selfish consumer, that charitable giving isn't rational, because there's no commodity being received. So you're not like, it's not when, like I go buy a pizza. The way I conceived of it was that if I go out and give charitably, then I'm gaining sort of like a socially good feeling as the commodity for that.
Okay.
Is that a way to reconcile, say, the...
You raised a very important point, which is the difference between self-interest and rationality. Rationality just means that you do things in a coherent way, given your preferences. Self-interest means that your preferences are such that you only care about yourself. So if you have preferences for, say, curing cancer, eliminating cancer, this is your preference, this is the main thing that you care about, you can still be rational about it and donate all your money to cancer cure, because that is what you're trying to maximize. Now, so that is a very important distinction. Often people confuse rationality with self-interest. You can be perfectly rational and have no self-interest whatsoever. Okay? The second question that you asked is, could you be buying the feeling, a fuzzy feeling of happiness when you give? Actually, economists have a name for that. They call it the warm glow. And most evidence on charity suggests that that's what drives people. Because when you change the effectiveness of charity, say, you give $1, there is a matching donor that gives $1, or you give $1 and the matching donor gives $5, the amount that people give don't change. So people see that as a sign that people like the feeling of giving, but not effectively what the giving achieves. So definitely, I think there is evidence for what you call the fuzzy feeling.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Oriana, over on
Where
your...
are you?
Right, hi. So on Twitter that's come through, first question, in which part of the world would you say economists' advice is most welcome in policy making? And a follow-up to that is, if the governments in those countries don't pay attention much to the issues raised by economists, what should economists do then?
So those are very important questions. I would say that economist advice is needed everywhere, just because, as I said, it's a tool, so the questions might change. The type of advice that different governments need might differ, but the usefulness of the tool does not depend on the question. And what should we do if they don't listen? That is a very tricky question, because there is somehow a sense of righteousness that some researchers have, where they say, we know the truth, you have to do what our experiments suggest, what our research suggests. But ultimately, researchers are not elected representatives. We are paid by universities, we're not being elected to run a country. So all we can provide is information, make sure that we provide information about our research in the clearest possible way, but it's up to the legally elected representative of the country to use that data. I don't think it's the job of researchers to advocate for one thing or another in their official position as researchers. Of course, as private individuals, you can do whatever you want.
Do you think economics is an objective and universally applicable science?
Can you repeat?
Do you think economics is a universally applicable and objective science?
I think it's a tool, again, that can be used to address many questions. I think it's wrong to extrapolate from one setting to another without knowing which characteristics of the setting led to your findings. So, for instance, if you do the experiment in Zambia, as I did, hadn't you uncovered all the mechanisms, but you only found that one ad works better than another, and you were to repeat it somewhere else without knowing why it works, there's no guarantee that it would work in another country, right? So I think it's important to understand why things work, not what works. And many things are universal, because ultimately economics studies how humans make choices. And I think that humans are the same wherever they are. Any other questions? Twitter?
So we have a question on why did you become an economist?
Shall I give the honest answer or the role model answer?
Both.
The honest, always honesty prevails. The honest answer is that I was undecided between philosophy and mathematics. And my father, who was a lot more pragmatic, said, in both cases, you will starve. And I said, well, I don't care, I want to live of ideas. And he said, no, you need to live of bread. So he thought that neither mathematics nor philosophy was a particularly well-remunerated and productive career. And so I tried, he said, go and try economics. But to tell you the story completely, I tried business first, which is not for everybody. It was definitely not for me. And then I discovered economics, which actually happens to be somewhat of a mix of philosophy and mathematics. And so that's the end.
So as a follow-up to that, what's your message to young economists growing up seeing an increasing doubt about the discipline?
To go out and tell people what economics really is. Because the doubt about the discipline is founded on ignorance of what the discipline is. Most of the criticism that we read on newspapers are based on a version of economics that maybe existed maybe 60 years ago, but not even. And also, there is a lot of focus on the topics rather than on the tools. And the tools are very useful, especially in this day and age where policymakers have taken it to claim things which are highly undefendable. So if you know how to argue against those, we're all going to be better off.
So you said that it's the study of, well, economics is the study of human behavior, but you could also argue that like psychology and neuroscience are also the study of human behavior. Are the two subjects becoming more integrated as time goes on? Like you mentioned, one of the Nobel Prizes was studying how economics can integrate psychology. Will psychology also integrate economics in its study?
So I think what differs between the two is not the topics. The topics largely overlap, but it is the methods. So economics takes causality very seriously and takes evident, theory-based empirical exercises very seriously. And that allows you to understand not just what works. So economics is not a collection of things that we find, it's a collection of mechanisms that is understanding why things work. So despite the questions being the same, the method is very different. There's a question all the way up there.
Why do you think so few economists spotted the crash in 2008?
For the same reason that if you go to a cardiologist and you tell him that you eat burgers and fries for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, he's going to tell you you're going to have a heart attack with a very high probability, but he's not going to tell you that it's going to happen on March the 15th of 2022. So many economists said that the system was unstable. Nobody could predict the exact date. That's not the aim. There's another question.
Thank you. I think quite a lot of what you've said so far is preoccupied with microeconomic investigation. I just wonder whether you think the same sort of success is possible at the macroeconomic level.
I surely hope so. I'm a microeconomist, so I can only talk about the things that I know. You saw in the slides that I showed at the beginning that actually most of economics is what I'm talking about today. I know that there are lots of debates about how macroeconomic is funded, but I don't think I'm informed enough to give you a definite answer on that.
Oriana, hi at the back. Oriana, in a couple of weeks' time, the MPs of the UK will have a meaningful vote on Brexit, and this is likely to be the biggest political decision they will make in the lifetimes of many of the people in this room. What would your words of wisdom be to those MPs as an economist?
I was waiting for that question. It always comes. And in particular, it comes because economists, you know, the stereotype of economists, the number one thing is that we're selfish and market-loving. And the second one is that we never agree on anything. And so the debate on Brexit has been heavily depicted like a debate, as if half of the economists would say it's a good idea, and the other half would say it's a bad idea. I never understood why it's been depicted like that, maybe because you want to keep the stereotype of the economist being, it depends, on two hands. There is consensus. In the profession, there is 99% of academic economists, research-active economists at top universities agree that Brexit is a terrible idea. And it doesn't even take an economist to understand that if you swap trade with your immediate neighbors who produce things of the quality and the type that your country demands, in exchange for uncertain trade with faraway countries who do not produce the things that your country demands, things cannot be better. And there is a final issue, which is the most contentious issue, which is the mobility of labor. I've read the Prime Minister's letter where she says that we're going to change the nature of immigration. We're going to get rid of all the immigrants from the EU. I'm from the EU. But we're going to get rid of all the bad immigrants, and we're going to only let in high-skilled, talented immigrants. Now, this is a perfect example. I was actually almost tempted to put it in the slide in my policy section. It's a perfect example of policy by wishful thinking. You're not taking into account the response of the immigrants. If funding for research in Britain collapses, if the economy becomes closed and insular, all these very high-skilled, talented immigrants, which you generously let in, I don't think they're going to want to come here. You can bring a horse to water, you can't make them drink. So it's all well and good that you want to swap one type of immigrant for another, but that type of immigrant, this better variety, needs to be interested in coming. And the way things are going, I doubt that will happen.
Hi. There's a general opinion, and also it has some valid evidence behind that, that among social science discipline, economics is very much less inclusive in nature, in the sense that we get in top school or all these universities, if you just simply glance through this, it's predominantly the less evidence of a black faculty. So do you think that this has something to do with discipline itself? And the next quick question is, do you think that gradually over the last 4 or 5 decades, the discipline within social science, economics is basically becoming as a methodology-driven discipline rather than conveying the content of the message?
So I think great part, and the main reason why I'm doing this, other than rant about Brexit, is to tell people what economics really is. Because the same people who lament the lack of women, the lack of ethnic minorities in economics, are the same people who depict economics in a way that only attracts rich white men who want to work in finance. So there is a strong inconsistency in all of this criticism of economics, because on the one hand, you give wrong information, and then you complain that people who select into the discipline based on that wrong information are not the type of people that you would like. I think it's important because economics studies people, it's important to have diversity. And I hope that by economists telling more and more what the subject is about and the potential of using the tools for addressing social issues, addressing discrimination, addressing immigration, poverty, inequality, that will attract a more diverse set of people. I just wanted to say, before I started the lecture, the organizers told me, please make sure that you take a question from a man, talking about diversity, and a question from a woman, because women never ask questions. And I said, nah, that's not true. I always ask questions. But tragically, it is true. Can you help me win this argument? Can girls ask some questions? Could be about anything, really. Thank you.
What would you say the best route to go on if you want to get into sort of advising policymakers and you're just doing your undergraduate right now? What would you say a good step would be in the right direction?
So the government economic services have a fantastic internship program that you can apply to. And there are many outfits in the UK, for instance, the International Growth Centre, that provides advice to governments in developing countries. Apply for internships. Learn on the job.
Another one on Twitter. Do you believe the gender pay gap is a result of discrimination or as a result of psychological and biological factors like childbirth and the careers they choose to pursue?
That is a very difficult question. I don't know where discrimination stops and the biology starts. I am very sure that the biological factors shouldn't make a difference. There are ways of designing society in a way that they do not make a difference, and yet the design of society maximizes the impact of those factors. Women can take 6 months paid maternity leave. Men can take 2 weeks. Last time I had a baby was 2 weeks. Maybe now it's become 4 weeks. So once you have a baby and you stay home with the baby for 4 months, then you develop a comparative advantage, even if you don't have one to start with. And then you are in that path dependent. Now, is this discrimination? And of course, the employers are going to pay you less because you spend more time with the baby, then they're paying less for the same amount, for less work. But is this discrimination? I think it is at a society level. But I don't know if we can prove it employer by employer.
Hi, thank you for a great lecture. I think your argument that economics is becoming broader over the past few decades is really interesting, and it's true in terms of topics, that now economists with this toolbox can study anything. But I wonder what you think about because a lot of people, particularly outside of economics and those within economics that are not using the right tools or that are using theories that are outside of the mainstream, see a narrowing of the field of economics. So in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and some parts of the 70s, you would have debates between Keynesians, Marxians, Schumpeterians, Hayekians, and neoclassicals, whereas now that debate is largely gone. And as you saw with like you listed all the Nobel Prize winners recently, that had lots of different topics, but all using pretty much the same approach or within the same framework. So I wonder if you think that's a loss to economics, or your position on that.
That is very true, because the one thing I didn't say is that the tools limit the questions that you can ask. Because if we can only be satisfied with evidence of causality, we will never ask questions that cannot be answered in that way. So I don't think it's an ideology as such that prevails, as many people depict it. But I think that it is a methodology which then shapes the questions that can be asked. And one set of important questions for which economics tools are useless is value questions. You know, how do we compare the benefits and the costs to different groups in society? How do we compare a system where workers have more bargaining rights than employers? Economics is all written from the point of view of the employer. I was teaching the principal agent framework yesterday, actually, in my development class. And one thing that I always thought is you could equally reverse it. I don't know if you guys know the principal agent framework, but it's always depicted like an employer hires an employee. The employee is lazy. He always wants to shirk. And the employer must find a way to make sure that the employee doesn't shirk. Now, you could do it exactly the other way around, because it is the same problem. The employee is hired by the employer. He wants to have a work-life balance. The employer wants to exploit him to death. You can use the same tool to ask that question, but yet it's not asked that way. So I think it's true that the tools limit us, but still within the tools that we have, we could do more.
This is just a question from one of our students. In the next 10 to 20 years, how do you see economics helping society develop for the better?
Well, by reversing Brexit to start with. No, I think there is a lot of research which is being done on poverty, which actually we have a much better idea of what can help with poverty reduction than we had before. So hopefully that's going to be incorporated in policy. There is a lot of evidence on health. There is, in general, a lot of progress being made in understanding how people respond to policies. So hopefully there will be better designed and more effective policies. And again, hopefully there will be a more diverse set of people studying economics.
So with developments in artificial intelligence and automation, there's been like a lot of fear that there's going to be like mass unemployment in the future. How do you think the economy is going to change within like the next 50 to 100 years, if that's even, you can even predict that? And will like things like universal basic income ever be a solution?
Of course. Now, there was fear that the automated, what do you call it? Sorry, I forgot the name. The spinner to make clothes would destroy employment forever. You know, the one prediction of Keynes that didn't come through is that we would all be working 15-hour weeks. I wish that were the case. I would love to have a 15-hour week, but it didn't happen. Now, employment is not good in and of itself. If we find a way of producing resources and producing goods and allocating resources by having leisure all the time, I don't think anybody would mind. What is essential, though, and the reason people are worried about automation, is that the owners of those machines will have everything, and because they don't need workers anymore, the workers will have nothing. So it is not an issue whether technology is bad because it shrinks the overall pie. It will increase the pie without doubt. At least it always has. The issue is how you share the pie.
Another one on Twitter. Many economists are now writing papers analysing medical data which aim to influence medical practice despite not being trained in biology. Do you think this is potentially irresponsible?
It depends on the questions that you ask. So I don't think there is any economist who analyze medical data and then go give prescriptions to people. But there are economists who analyze medical data to understand which policy is more effective, whether we should subsidize a type of medicine or not, which medicines should be offered by the NHS, which pay structure of doctors provide a better service. All those are questions for economists. Of course, if economists start giving health advice, it's not a good idea, or performing surgery, but it's not the same thing, is it?
Is it not then a case that economists could be helping to devise and recommending things in fields that they just don't understand or they don't fully have a grasp of? Because I've definitely read papers in the past where economists have said something without a full understanding of the system that they're trying to advise on.
But that is true for economics topics as well. There are bad articles as there are good articles everywhere. I don't think it's the topics in particular, is how prepared the person is and how much care they put in writing the article. I'm not saying, I don't want to give you the impression that all of economics is good. Most research in economics is perfectly useless or harmful. It's difficult to be harmful. Most research is useless.
Thank you. I have a question, very general question. I'm a PhD in economics. I read so many papers, as you see, they are useless. If I'm learning economics, I know I can contribute to the development of economic theories. So what should I think of learning economics?
So by useless, I didn't mean that all of economics is useless, far from the truth. We build, to make discoveries, we have to rule out things that don't work. So there are a lot, I would say that 90% of my production never sees the light of day because our way of thinking of a problem, which then leads to a dead end, or attempts at running an experiment with a government or with an organization that then changes their mind half the way. So in that sense, there are many failed attempts, but I think that is the nature of research. A lot of research consists in ruling out things that don't work to find the ones that do. So in that sense, it's not useless.
So I just wonder from the point of view of myself, if I'm not seeing that the things about doing research economics. For me, if I know I can't do research like the greatest economist, I can't build a very useful theory for economics for our society. I even can't publish paper on top 5 journals. So should I still doing research economics in my lifetime? Or so what's the benefits of still doing research economics? I just wonder.
Well, every piece of research contributes to common knowledge. So well-done research, regardless of whether it's published, contributes to common knowledge. There is a massive externality in doing good research. I think we don't reap nearly a fraction of the benefits that the research creates. So it depends whether you believe that it can make even a tiny difference, but most importantly, it depends whether you like it or not.
Okay, thank you.
Never do things that you don't enjoy doing.
Hi, Oriana. Last couple of questions before we finish.
Yeah.
So first of all, do you, Brexit again, do you think the choice made to leave the EU was based more on political identity than the idea of economic prosperity?
Absolutely. So one of the regions, actually the towns with the highest share of leave vote was a town, which name now I can't remember, where Toyota is the main employer. And Toyota said that if the UK leaves the EU, they're going to close the factory. So people effectively voted for losing their jobs.
Yeah.
So.
And finally, in economics, is there such a thing as right and wrong?
So that links to the question that was asked earlier. Economics is not well equipped. Our methods do not allow us to do moral value judgments. So it's right depends how you define it. If you define it right as efficient, then of course we have criteria to measure efficiency. But moral virtues and all the parts that was left with philosophy, and hopefully will come back, but it's not there now.
Hi, thank you again for your lecture. So I have a sort of quick question, and essentially my point comes from this perspective that economists have the ears of policymakers in a way that anthropologists, political scientists, and historians don't. This largely seems to be because economics presents as an objective and value-neutral science. But as your comments about diversity imply, we don't come to research from a value-neutral position. So would you say that economics has a respectability issue, a respectability problem relative to other disciplines? And if this is the case, what do we do to change this?
So there's many ways of answering your question. The first, perhaps, is that if you think economics is not respectable, what makes anthropology more respectable? What do you think makes anthropologists neutral, whereas economists are biased? So that would be my first answer, which is a standard economics answer. Think of the counterfactual and tell me how it's better. I don't think that economics has the ear of the policymakers because it claims to be neutral. I think it's because it can provide causal evidence, and it's a very rigorous and data-based discipline, whereas the others are not. In the center there.
What advice would you give to people wishing to study economics at uni who are currently doing A-levels?
This is going to sound awful. Take maths and further maths. Try to understand statistics as well as you can. Statistics is strangely under-taught everywhere. I don't know a single country where statistics is put at the forefront of teaching, and yet it's probably the most important subject. A lot of, say, insurance companies would make way less profits if people were to understand probabilities. So study statistics, study maths and further maths. It is fun, and it's going to help you build and use the tools of economics. Well, the mic says, but most importantly, think of the difference that you can make by having rigorous evidence on important questions. No, there is a question just behind me.
Thank you for the lecture. As someone who has a health background coming into economics, it was a very daunting decision for me. Do you think that economics needs to be better incorporated in across disciplines so that people can have a better understanding of this discipline? Thank you.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, there's many colleagues who are making great effort in making economics more accessible. And frankly, I don't believe when people tell me it is too complicated to explain, because nothing is too complicated to explain. You only have people who don't understand what they're trying to explain.
I think we've got time for just one more question, sure. if that's okay.
Hi, so I'm a biologist, and in our field, it's rare, but it does happen where vested interest, specifically financial interest, gets in the way of academic papers, the most famous one being autism and how that relates to vaccination. Yeah. How big of a problem is it in economics? Because I think in biology it's fairly self-correcting.
So I don't think directly, that is, I don't know of any case of papers being commissioned to prove something like the way it happens in the medical sciences. But of course, the people who can afford the advice of economists are people who can pay. And so a lot of economics is skewed towards, as the example I was bringing before, the principal agent problem. We think of the interest of the employer and how it can rein in employees rather than the other way around. Policymakers typically, politicians typically care about benefiting the people who would vote for them. And most of the weakest groups in society for which economic research would be valuable, say for poverty reduction, tend not to vote. And so it's hard for these messages. So there's a selection, but it's not, I think, of the nature of a pure transaction from an interested party to a researcher who's willing to say whatever the interest party wants them to say. I think it's more of an issue that the economic results that get used are selected by politicians in a way that benefits them.
Okay, so I need to have three big thank yous. Firstly, thank you to you as the audience for coming along today and asking such great questions. Secondly, to the Royal Economic Society for very kindly sponsoring the lecture and organising it and bringing everything together. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, to thank you, Oriana, for such a splendid lecture and showing the true power of economics. And it's been a delight. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.